Okay, so hi everyone, and thank you for joining this lecture. As you can see, and as can probably be expected, in the past 2 years, this paper has changed and developed. So the title and some of the content changed a bit, but the general idea stayed pretty much the same. So today I'd like to talk to you about three different versions of intuitionism suggested by Brouwer, Herman Weyl, and Heyting that received different reactions from the mathematical community. My objective is to point towards a possible connection between the community's reactions and the changes each mathematician had proposed. So let's start with some background. At the turn of the 20th century, the British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell discovers Russell's paradox. Russell's paradox shows that every set theory that contains an unrestricted comprehension principles leads to contradiction. The underlying meaning of this paradox is that it is a symptom of a much larger problem, which is that the foundations of mathematics are unstable. Driven by this problematic discovery, in 1907, Brouwer presents his intuitionism as an attempt to provide a solution to the foundational problem. Intuitionism offered a different way to create, build, and understand mathematics. According to the intuitionistic point of view, mathematics is a creation of the mind, and it is the result of mental construction. Deeply influenced by Brouwer's ideas, in 1921, Herman Weyl presents his own version of intuitionism, and in 1930, Heyting presents his formalization of intuitionism. Their works are considered part of what is known as the foundational debate, which is often situated somewhere between 1907 and 1935, and this is the time period in which I will focus on in this lecture. This histogram is taken from Dennis Hassling's book, Gnomes in the Fog, and it represents all reactions to intuitionism known to Hassling between 1907 and 1933. We see here that Brouwer's intuitionism received very little attention. The spike in 1921 is attributed to Weyl's paper, and the peak of the discussion was somewhere between 1927 and 1933, around the time that Heyting published his work. So what can explain the community's reaction? Why Brouwer's intuitionism received so little attention, Weyl's a bit more, and Heyting was the most popular out of the three? So most historians and philosophers claim that it was Weyl's clear and coherent writing style, his use of war metaphors, and the fact that he was Hilbert's prominent student that made his 1921 paper much more readable and approachable than Brouwer's work. The popularity of Heyting's brand of intuitionism is often attributed to its disentanglement from Brouwer's deep philosophical considerations and to Heyting's use of formalized methods. While these explanations are certainly true, they portray only part of the picture, as they mostly account for the practical differences between the three stories. I want to suggest that the difference between the three mathematicians' versions of intuitionism runs deeper. Each of them held different views regarding the normative boundaries of the discipline that were reflected in the respective versions of intuitionism each of them had produced. In order to do that, I turn to Leo Corey's two-tiered model of mathematical thought. So historian of mathematics Leo Corey borrows his terminology of the image and body of knowledge from Yehuda Elkanah, who in 1978 suggested that every scientific discipline can be viewed as comprising two interconnected layers of thought, the body of knowledge and the image of knowledge. Elkanah characterizes the body of knowledge as where the research is done. It consists of various first-order scientific theories, concepts, ideas, and procedures. Second-order images of knowledge, by contrast, govern certain aspects of scientific activity that are not contained within the body of knowledge, such as the sources of knowledge, the legitimization of knowledge, the audience of knowledge, and the relatedness to prevailing norms and ideologies. Corey applies Elkanah's distinction between the image and body of knowledge to mathematics and distinguishes between the body of mathematical knowledge, which includes theories, facts, methods, and open problems, and the images of mathematics, which includes guiding principles that help us discuss questions that arise from the body of mathematical knowledge but cannot be settled within it. Questions such as which of the open problems of the discipline are those that urgently need attention, and what is considered a relevant experiment, or what is considered as a legitimate methodology of the discipline, and more of this kind. Corey's novel claim is that in mathematics, unlike other disciplines, questions pertaining to both the body and images of knowledge are contained within mathematics itself. Mathematics is uniquely endowed with an ability to absorb certain images of knowledge directly into the body of knowledge. That is what Corey calls the reflexive character of mathematics, and we shall return to this aspect later on. Let us now turn to examine how each mathematician viewed the body and image of mathematics. So Brouwer's views on which questions belong to the body and which question belongs to the image of mathematical knowledge can be extracted from his views regarding the difference between intuitionism and formalism. He claims that the question where mathematical exactness does exist is answered differently by the two sides. The intuitionist says in the human intellect. The formalist says on paper. For the formalist, therefore, mathematical exactness consists merely in the method of developing the series of relations and is independent of the significance one might want to give to the relations or to the entities they relate. So Brouwer perceives the boundaries of mathematics differently than the formalist does. He criticizes the formalist for using methods and systems that can be disconnected from their underlying meanings. And so he goes on and says, the viewpoint of the formalist must lead to the conviction that if other symbolic formulas should be substituted for the ones that now represent the fundamental mathematical relations and the mathematical logical laws, the absence of the sensation of delight called the consciousness of legitimacy, which might be the result of such substitution, would not in the least invalidate its mathematical exactness. So we cannot reduce mathematics to a set of symbols and axioms without carefully considering the meaning behind those symbols and where do they lead us. If they lead us to contradictions, there's a problem that must be attended to. So what constitutes Brouwer's image of mathematical knowledge? First, as I've mentioned before, mathematics, according to Brouwer, is a creation of the mind, in the sense that the existence of a mathematical object is equivalent to the possibility of its construction in one's mind. Moreover, Brouwer firmly believed that human beings have an intuitive grasp of the continuum as a whole, which means that according to Brouwer, a continuum that is constructed out of a set of independently given points like the Cantorian continuum cannot be considered a legitimate mathematical entity. As a result of these changes, the idea of mathematical truth and its relation to the probability and refutability of a mathematical claim was also redefined. According to the intuitionistic point of view, double negation does not mean existence. Knowing that a statement P is true means having a constructive proof of it. To negate P is to claim that P is refutable, that is, that a counterexample exists. But it does not imply that the statement not P is true or provable. So from here, it derives that the principle of excluded middle and proofs of existence by contradiction are no longer considered legitimate techniques within the discipline. Brouwer suggested a new image of knowledge that is rooted in meta-mathematical considerations, namely philosophical ones. But what happens to the body of knowledge? Brouwer's intuitionistic program entailed deep and comprehensive changes to the image of knowledge, yet it did not call into question a single theory in the body of classical mathematics. No previously proven results were rejected. Some were deemed unacceptable according to the new Brouwerian image of knowledge, but none were proven wrong or contradictory in consequence of Brouwer's intuitionism. Let us now turn to examine Hermann Weyl's version of intuitionism. So deeply disturbed by the paradoxes of set theory and inspired by his meeting in 1919 with Brouwer in Engadin, 2 years later, in 1921, Hermann Weyl publishes his paper titled On the New Foundational Crisis in Mathematics. According to most historians, this paper put intuitionism on the map and made it reach a wider audience than it would ever reach before if it wasn't for Weyl's paper. The paper is divided to 3 parts. The first part is an exposition of Brouwer's ideas. The second part describes Weyl's attempt so far to deal with the foundational problem. And in the third part, Weyl presents his own intuitionistic version. So what is Weyl's new intuitionistic version? Weyl agrees with Brouwer about the unreliability of the principle of excluded middle. He also sees the continuum as a continuous entity that cannot be divided into separate fragments, and he also agrees that existential and universal statements are meaningful only if they are defined using constructive procedures. However, unlike Brouwer, Weyl maintains that existence statements are legitimate only if they contain informative content. For example, the statement, "there is an even number," is not legitimate according to Weyl, since it does not indicate which number is it. In contrast, the statement, "2 is an even number," is legitimate since it points to the specific entity. But from the paper emerges another significant difference between the two regarding the connection between the image and the body of knowledge. After Weyl introduces the concept of functional continua, he continues and writes, "But let me emphasize again that individual determined functions of this sort occur from case to case in theorems of mathematics, yet one never makes general theorems about them. The general formulations of this concept is therefore only required if one gives an account of the meaning and the method of mathematics. For mathematics itself and the content of its theorems, it does not come into consideration at all." So despite his overwhelming support of Brouwer's ideas, Weyl sees the body and the image of mathematical knowledge as somewhat disconnected. On the one hand, he calls to rebuild mathematics on solid foundations, but on the other hand, he is not too quick to forego all the theories and proofs that are part of that unstable body of knowledge. Similar to Brouwer's intuitionism, the changes suggested by Weyl's intuitionism affected only the images of knowledge. It is true that the works of Brouwer and Weyl posed some interesting and deep questions for a small but important sector of the mathematical community, but they did not disprove a single theory from the classical body of knowledge, nor did they use classical methods to articulate their intuitionistic ideas. Unlike the works of Brouwer and Weyl, Heyting's formalization of intuitionistic mathematics entails a different kind of change to the body and image of mathematical knowledge. Heyting was Brouwer's student at the University of Amsterdam during the 1920s. His dissertation, which was supervised by Brouwer, was devoted to an extensive study of axiomatization in constructive mathematics. And in 1930, he published a series of 3 papers presenting a formalization of intuitionistic logic and mathematics, which are considered today as the most influential publication in mathematical intuitionism, alongside with his book from 1956, An Intuitionism Introduction. So like Brouwer, Heyting believed that mathematical entities do not exist outside of the human mind. As he writes, intuitionistic mathematics consists in mental constructions, and mathematical theory expresses a purely empirical fact, namely the success of a certain construction. 2 + 2 = 3 + 1 must be read as an abbreviation for the statement, "I have affected the mental constructions indicated by 2 + 2 and by 3 + 1, and I have found that they lead to the same result." However, Heyting held a different view regarding the role of philosophy in mathematics. "We must distinguish between the simple practice of mathematics," claims Heyting, "and its valuation. In order to construct mathematical theories, no philosophical preliminaries are needed, but the value we attribute to this activity will depend upon our philosophical ideas." However, Heyting's disentanglement from Brouwer's philosophical considerations should be taken with a pinch of salt. Heyting may state that the only philosophical thesis of mathematical intuitionism is that no philosophy is needed to understand mathematics, but even his own writings show that mathematical intuitionism depends on views and choices concerning meaning, introspection, and the limit of acceptable idealization. In this respect, Heyting was no less philosophically engaged than Brouwer. Unlike his teacher, Heyting insisted on adopting a formalist methodology in practice. In an interview he gave to Dirk van Dalen and Walter van Sticht, Heyting described the differences between his and Brouwer's image of knowledge. As to your question about Brouwer's attitude towards formalism, I would like to add that he always maintained that formalizing mathematics is unproductive, since mathematics is constructing in the mind, of which language, and therefore also a formal system, can only give inadequate representation. I have become more and more convinced that at least in the communication of mathematics, formalization has its great advantages. From recent research into the notion of choice sequence, it has become apparent that for any sufficiently clear representation, formalization is even necessary. Thus, Heyting viewed the formalization of intuitionism primarily as a tool for mathematical research that can contribute to the development of intuitionistic theories and ideas. So, what did Heyting change? In the 1930 series of papers, Heyting presented his axioms for intuitionistic propositional logic, arithmetic, and number theory. In a letter to Oscar Becker, he described how he obtained those axioms. I shifted the axioms and theorems of Principia Mathematica, and on the basis of those that were found to be admissible, I looked for a system of independent axioms. So Heyting developed an intuitionistic system by cutting down a classical axiomatic systems to fit the intuitionist viewpoint. On the top right box, you can see Heyting's axioms for intuitionistic propositional logic, and from this system, one can create the classical counterpart. Those of you who are still awake at this part of my lecture can probably notice the difference between the intuitionistic system and the classical one, and the difference is the absence of the principle of excluded middle, which you can see in the box right below, that is taken from the Principia Mathematica and is missing from Heyting's axiomatization. So what do we see in Heyting's version of intuitionism? We see a change first and foremost to the image of knowledge, since Heyting's intuitionism is rooted in philosophical considerations, not the same as Brouwer's philosophical considerations, but there are still philosophical considerations. But the thing that Heyting does, and Brouwer and Weyl did not do, is to use the current body of knowledge in order to articulate this change to the image of knowledge. Remember the reflexive character of mathematics? So this is the third act. Corey suggests that mathematics is endowed with a unique connection between its image and body of knowledge. In mathematics, there is a third, intermediate layer, which involves both the body and image of knowledge, to which Corey refers to as reflexive thinking. And so he said, reflexive thinking is clearly a part of the body of mathematical knowledge because it is produced as any other piece of mathematical knowledge and is justified by proof. On the other hand, it is produced by concentrating on purely second-order problems, and hence it is related to the images of knowledge. So, read through Corey's prism, Heyting's formalization of intuitionism can be viewed as part of this intermediate layer. Heyting's use of formal methods to express a philosophical view of mathematical entities as creation of the mind produces a piece of mathematical knowledge that belongs to the body of knowledge, but also to the images of knowledge, as it concentrates on a normative question of how mathematics should be properly done. Heyting's formalization put intuitionistic logic and classical logic side by side as two parallel systems, a move that encouraged mathematicians and logicians to develop and analyze the intuitionistic system as well and compare between the two. And indeed, they reacted. In 1932, mathematician Alfred Herrera and logician Marcel Barzin embarked upon a public discussion with Heyting through a series of papers, which shone a spotlight on Heyting's work and made other renowned mathematicians such as Kurt Gödel, Gerhard Genzel, Karl Menger, and others engage with Heyting's formalization of intuitionism and develop it even further. So, to conclude, by applying Corey's two-tiered model to the works of Brouwer, Weyl, and Heyting, we discover a deeper difference between the three versions. Unlike Brouwer and Weyl, who suggested a comprehensive change to the image of mathematical knowledge while leaving the classical body of knowledge entirely unaltered, Heyting's formalization of intuitionism affected an intermediate layer unique to mathematics through which his image of knowledge was absorbed into the classical body of knowledge. This perspective takes into account the idea that each of the three mathematicians perceived the image of mathematics differently, and it remains true to Heyting's own viewpoint, as he himself stated in a paper written only 2 years before his death. I regret that my name is known today mainly in connection with these papers, namely the 1930 papers. They were of little help in the struggle to which I devoted my life, namely a better understanding and appreciation of Brouwer's ideas. They diverted the attention from the underlying ideas to the formal system itself. So the perspective I suggested here contributes to existing historical and philosophical accounts by providing an additional aspect to the narrative of the development of intuitionism that was left out of the story so far. It keeps Heyting's own intention in using formal methods to introduce intuitionistic ideas while also providing a possible explanation for mathematicians' inclination to engage, develop, and respond to Heyting's versions of intuitionism, but not to do the same to Brouwer's or Weyl's. Thank you.